For over 1,000 years, Mecca has been known as the heart of the Islamic world. Millions of people turn towards it every year, pray, and circle the holy Kaaba. But what if the location of the Kaaba is wrong? What if the real Mecca, forgotten in the shadow of history, is the mysterious city of Petra in Jordan, 1,000 kilometers to the north? In recent years, some researchers have come up with a provocative claim that shakes the foundations of Islamic history. According to them, the first Muslims turned towards Petra instead of Mecca, and the original location of the Kaaba, the most sacred symbol of Islam, was here. Clues such as the surprising orientations of the first mosques, the lack of written sources on early Islamic history, and the ancient pagan origins of the holy black stone lead us to question this extraordinary claim. Historians and researchers such as Patricia Crone, Michael Cook, and researcher Dan Gibson present evidence supporting this theory and suggest that we should rethink the traditional narrative of Islamic history. So which is true? Was Mecca really the center of Islam? Or was this story a reflection of a reality changed for political and religious reasons? Today we will explore this mystery in depth together. We will stand at the intersection of history, archaeology, and religion. We will examine every clue, from the pagan cults of the Middle East to the mysterious origins of the Black Stone and the true Qibla of the first Muslims. Who knows, maybe at the end of this journey, we can find some truths together. Welcome to Finding the Truth. History repeats itself constantly, and humanity often does not learn from these cycles. But there are some who listen to the warnings and manage to transform their lives. For example, I've been telling you the same thing for 2 years. Invest in your future with Sorbil. My followers who took this into account and joined Sorbil have now perhaps already moved their lives to new places with brand new skills. Sorbil is an AI-supported online education platform. It contains hundreds of courses in software, foreign languages, career, and personal development. Moreover, with Sorbil Premium, you can have unlimited access to hundreds of courses on Sorbil for the price of a single course elsewhere. From English to Excel, from Python to Photoshop, every training is prepared by expert trainers and goes through quality control. When you complete the training, you receive your CPD-approved international certificate and open a global door to your career. Sorbil's special artificial intelligence, Billy, coaches you 24/7. It answers your questions instantly, identifies your shortcomings, and prepares special tests. Moreover, you can access both Sorbil and Billy from anywhere in the world, either via computer or mobile application. Now with the coupon code Gerçek30 written in the description, you can get an additional 30% discount by purchasing the annual Sorbil Premium membership for only 323 Turkish lira and benefit from hundreds of courses for a year for the price of almost one meal. Remember, investing in yourself instead of unnecessary expenses is the most beautiful lesson to be learned from history that constantly repeats itself. Mecca, the mother of cities. Actually, the problems start right here. Generally, people today say that the Quran confirms Mecca as the mother of cities, based on verse 92 of Surah Al-An'am. However, there are some points we need to address here. Mecca is not directly mentioned in the surah. Only the word al-Qura, meaning the mother of cities, is mentioned. Of course, it is natural for Islamic historians to associate this with Mecca, because the concept of the mother of cities in Islamic history is associated with the city of Mecca, where Prophet Abraham left his wife and son and later rebuilt the Kaaba, which is believed to have been destroyed after the flood. However, it is unknown why the Quran did not explicitly call this city Mecca. In fact, the word Mecca appears directly only once in the Quran. In all other references, you actually see indirect references such as Baka or, as just mentioned, al-Qura and similar terms. Baka is also a word meaning bottleneck or narrow place. This semantic gap has led historians and researchers like Patricia Crone, Tom Holland, Robert Spencer, and most popularly, Dan Gibson, who shook the Islamic world with his documentary, The Sacred City, in 2016, to wonder if this mother of cities mentioned in Islam's holy book was not Mecca but another place. I am leaving the links to the author's books in the description. Those who are curious can read them. I will not bore you by explaining what the authors wrote in their books one by one. Therefore, we will address the most general theses. The main points that the authors focus on are the fact that Mecca, described as a city so supreme as to be called the mother of cities in the Quran, was not actually such a city in real history. The phenomenon that the Qiblas of early Islamic mosques did not point to the Kaaba, and the relationship between the Ibn Zubayr rebellion and Petra. If you wish, let's start with these claims and go deeper, layer by layer, on our journey. If we piece together the claims of the researchers I just mentioned, the first thing we encounter is the information that Mecca actually did not have a very important place in history, and its name was hardly mentioned in pre-Islamic periods. This is not a claim that can be immediately dismissed, because historical sources about Mecca are indeed very scarce. People like Ubayd Shar al-Jurhumi, Ibn Ishaq, and Tabari, who started writing the history of Islam 100 to 200 years after the major events, based their research primarily on hadiths and narrations due to the almost complete lack of written recording systems before them, and they described Mecca as a great commercial center. Because once again, these people did not know much about the ancient pagan history of Mecca, and the earliest writers started writing this information more than 100 years after the Prophet finished his mission and passed away. So by that time, Mecca had already become a large commercial city. For this reason, please keep this in mind when examining post-Prophet Islamic history. And do not forget that these people lived under the absolute control of the Umayyads and Abbasids. As you know, history is written by the victors. Apart from these recent historians, the Greek geographer Ptolemy, who lived in the 2nd century and recorded his travels in the Middle East, mentions a city called Makoraba. This is somewhat ambiguous information, as some say the coordinates describe the surrounding area rather than Mecca, while others say they describe ancient Mecca, but it is not yet clear information. The first clear record that directly mentions Mecca is an Armenian geographical text, whose name you see at the bottom of the screen. The name is a bit difficult to say, and according to estimates, this source was written around the year 600, about 30 years after the birth of Prophet Muhammad. If we look at the archaeological records, a large number of archaeological remains have been found in cities around Mecca. For example, rock-cut tombs and inscriptions belonging to the Nabateans from the 1st century AD have been found in Hegra. Cisterns and stone wall remains from the early Bronze Age have been found in Al-Natata. Hundreds of inscriptions and various resting stations have been found along the Darbe Zubaydah road. But as the authors claim, such archaeological remains have not been found much in Mecca. I will give the answer to this later. First, let's finish the claims. Dan Gibson and other researchers with similar ideas say that the examples of fruits and trees, such as olives, dates, and grapes mentioned in the Quran, are products not well known in the barren environment of Mecca and are rather agricultural products belonging to the Palestine and Levant region. And in this context, since they somewhat contradict the idea that Mecca was once a giant commercial city with the information I just gave, they make a logical inference and claim that the truly important commercial and religious center was actually the ancient city of Petra in northern Arabia. And they deepen their claims in the following way. Dan Gibson says that Petra has been an extremely important religious and commercial center for the geography since the day the Nabateans built it. This is actually correct information. We can say that Petra was truly the New York of ancient times, an oasis hidden between deep valleys with large water channels, a giant commercial center connecting the Arabian geography to the Mediterranean and Anatolia, and more importantly, a fascinating religious center with a very advanced architecture for its time, carved into the mountains where large idols were displayed. This ancient city was one of the homes of idols highly revered by Arabs such as Dushara, Lat, Uzza, and Manat, and it was a pilgrimage center. Now when I say pilgrimage center, don't think of it as a single point like today. We are talking about thousands of years ago. Because travel was difficult, there were pilgrimage centers for various beliefs in both Anatolia and Mesopotamia. This is exactly the moment when Dan Gibson and others deepen their work and make their golden shot. Researchers who advocate the idea that the real Kaaba was Petra, when combining all the available evidence, claim that the place that is the mother of cities in Islamic culture, which is fertile, religiously very important, located between valleys, and perhaps most importantly, the home of the Black Stone, is actually the holy Petra, one of the most magnificent cities in human history, instead of Mecca, whose historical records are barely found. They explain the connection to Mecca by the great rebellion started by Ibn Zubayr in 683, and that the Umayyads besieged Petra to suppress the rebellion of Ibn Zubayr. And since they hit the Kaaba of that time with catapults, Zubayr took the holy black stone in Petra to Mecca and declared it the new center of Islam there. Gibson continues by showing that the Qibla of various Umayyad mosques, built in the early period of Islam, actually faced Petra, not Mecca, for the Umayyads to have Petra as the main Qibla. He then continues by saying that after Ibn Zubayr was captured and killed, and his rebellion ended, the Umayyads took control of Zubayr's new Kaaba as their own Kaaba, in order to better control the geography, and began to include Mecca in historical records. It was exactly during these periods, according to Gibson, that the confusion of Qiblas in mosques began to resolve. And subsequently, with the collapse of the Umayyads and the rise of the Abbasids, the past with Petra was somewhat erased, and all the history that happened in Petra began to be narrated as if it had happened in Mecca. These are indeed strong claims, and while there are dozens of historical events about how the Umayyads and Abbasids shaped political Islam for their own interests, and what they gave to the essence of Islam as a control mechanism, it is natural that this claim suddenly made a big splash in the world. Because on paper, all scenarios actually make sense. And if we leave the story like this right here, I'm sure most of us would fall into the confusion of whether it is really so. However, this was just the first part of our journey. Now let's examine the antitheses of the issue. Because thanks to those counterclaims, a new door will actually open before us, and we will understand that the cause of almost all the confusion is a single object. Those small pieces of black stone that still stand at the corner of the Kaaba today, namely the Hajar al-Aswad. Wrong Qiblas, incorrect geographical descriptions in the Quran, and a Mecca that does not appear in history. As I said before, these are very serious claims. So what do we see when we look at the situation from the other side? Let's examine that a little too. First of all, let's start with the claim that Mecca is an insignificant place, because it does not have a sufficient history on the historical stage. In the first part I mentioned how the claim is based, and that although many ancient remains have been found around Mecca, they have not been found in Mecca itself. This is actually an event based on some fundamental historical reasons. Yes, at first glance, Mecca does not seem to be as large and powerful a commercial city as Tabari or early Islamic historians mentioned. But there is an important detail here. In the pre-Islamic pagan Arabian geography, there were cult alliances. For example, the Hums alliance consisted of tribes such as the Quraysh tribe, the Banu Kinanah tribe, and the Banu Amir. Apart from them, the Hila alliance consisted of 11 different tribes. And as you can imagine, with so many tribes, tensions have never been absent throughout history. However, all these pagan tribes have one common characteristic. During the month of Dhu al-Hijjah, and according to some sources, during a 3-month period, they would leave all conflicts and disputes and go to Mecca to perform their pilgrimage and worship. The region would host tribes coming from different places during that period, and both religious rituals and trade agreements would be made at the fairs and markets that were set up. And it would turn into a religious and commercial center, even if only for a certain period. We can access such early information in the verses about pilgrimages to Mecca, found in the poems and writings of poets like Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma and Al-Nabiga, who lived in the 6th century. This is why this region has always been called a sacred area. This is also why the Masjid al-Haram is called so today. That is an area where there is no fighting, no weapons are allowed, enmity is left behind, and even hunting is forbidden. Since the region was a sacred area, and naturally remained a neutral, unbiased area, Mecca could not develop as a city under someone's complete control at that time. This is why it is not mentioned as a great commercial city in historical records. Because according to the available data, it really wasn't, at least not outside of the pilgrimage seasons. As far as I understand, I will make a simple analogy, but you will understand the logic. Mecca was like the places that host today's Burning Man festival. A small place in normal times, but a place that suddenly booms during the festival and pilgrimage season. At least for now, this is the conclusion drawn from the available records. The reason why remains have not been found in Mecca, despite excavations in the neighboring cities, is actually even simpler. Because excavation is forbidden in the city. It was already declared a sacred area throughout history, and later became an even more untouchable city with Islam. For this reason, excavation there is extremely restricted today. Therefore, the fact that it is not mentioned as a great commercial city in historical records, as claimed by Tabari, and similar historians, does not mean that the city is completely false. It means that it was a neutral city that grew seasonally. If there are those who say, how can a huge pilgrimage center not be in all records? Swing, as I said before, do not think of the pilgrimage event like today. Pilgrimage centers were abundant in those lands at that time. For example, the city of Palmyra, Baalbek, various cities in Yemen, Ugarit, Petra, Babylon, and many more were sacred areas and pilgrimage centers, both in recent times and in their own times, and some became popular over time, while others were forgotten. We should also not forget that although many idols have come and gone in the Arabian geography, the respect and worship of Lat, Uzza, and Manat continued for a really long time. And when we examine the symbolism of these three goddesses, we find some interesting information. We know that when the goddess called Alat was worshipped, square-shaped, usually large stone blocks were used. This was an extremely common worship symbolism, especially in the city of Taif near Mecca. Menat or Manat was revered as a black stone in Yathrib, today's Medina, and its surroundings. Do not forget the black stone issue, I will come back to it later. So square structures and black stones were very widespread and important worship symbols belonging to the pagan period in the Arabian geography, and they were often used together for the worship rituals of these three goddesses. I have drawn attention to this intertwined symbolism in many of my videos. In fact, if we go deeper into the origins of this, the origin of Lat and Uzza can even be traced back to a single goddess, who is Inanna in Sumerian belief. Manat is more similar to the Moirai, who hold the threads of fate in Greek myths. And another interesting piece of information is that the Moirai actually consist of three goddesses. Now, if we start from here and make deductions and inductions, you will understand better how the symbols became intertwined and mixed over time. The symbolism of three goddesses, the symbolism of the black stone, and the symbolism of the idol made of a cube have all become intertwined over time. Where else do you think we see both these square worship structures and the great importance given to the black stone and the goddess that I just mentioned? In Petra, which Dan Gibson talks about. At the entrance of Petra, although only remnants remain today, you would be greeted by square and triangular structures on both sides. These are called jinn blocks today. But from an archaeological perspective, a common approach is that they were used as altars, as sacred symbolism in the past. It is known that pre-Islamic pagans performed rituals here. I think it is also a quite normal development that these structures are referred to as jinn blocks today, with those deities being called jinns after Islam, especially considering the education level of the local people in the region and their lack of knowledge of past history. This was the first point where Dan Gibson tried to strengthen his thesis. He says that the worship around the square structure was centered in Petra and later moved to Mecca. And more importantly, he claimed that the Hajar al-Aswad was also taken from Petra to Mecca, and thus the ritual of worshipping the black stone reached Mecca. However, I think this is a much deeper issue, and we will go into much more detail about it after the antitheses of the other claims. Let's move on to the situation where the agricultural products and fertile lands mentioned in the Quran are related to Petra in the north, not Mecca. One of the mistakes here is that the Quran mentioned grapes and olives, but those plants did not exist in Mecca, and it is really a bit of a forced claim, in my opinion, to interpret the geographical features with inferences and say that this place was more suitable for Petra than Mecca, and therefore Prophet Muhammad lived in Petra. After all, the trade of these plants and fruits has been carried out, and they have been known products in all corners of Arabia for hundreds of years. Moreover, the Quran does not describe Mecca as a land full of abundance and fertility. On the contrary, the verses describing the arrival of Prophet Abraham in Mecca mention it as a dry, barren area. And I remind you once again, even hundreds of years before Islam, as I said before, pilgrimages were made to Mecca, festivals were held, and trade relations were established. So it is not a geography unfamiliar with the products mentioned in the book. I will not even go into the elephant incident claim, because there is no record of such an event happening in the history of Petra and the Nabateans, or pre-Islamic Arabia, or Yemen, or even of any battle involving elephants. Although inscriptions belonging to Abraha have been found in Yemen, there is no information about an expedition to Mecca with elephants. Besides, it is physically impossible to fight a war with elephants in a desert environment. The entire army would have to carry food and water just for the elephants. I think this is something that is simply a mythologized and exaggerated retelling of a much older event. I plan to make a video about that someday. But in our topic, it has no tangible historical relevance, neither from Dan Gibson's perspective, nor from the perspective of counterclaims. Leaving aside the minor claims, we must address the biggest main problem that led to the emergence of this whole issue. Is the real Qibla the Kaaba in Mecca or Petra? And what is the relationship between the origin of worshipping the black stone and today's Kaaba? Now we are about to seek the answers to these questions and delve into the dark depths of the history of religions. Dan Gibson and similar researchers attach great importance to the black stone issue. According to Gibson's claim, Prophet Muhammad, who never lived in Mecca at any point in his life, was born and raised in Petra and performed his prophethood. And in the post-Islamic period, despite destroying all the idols in Petra, he did not touch the black stone, which is now called Hajar al-Aswad. Later, this stone went to Mecca with the Ibn Zubayr rebellion and remained there. So Dan Gibson's claim should not surprise you. According to his claim, everything presented to you as Mecca in Islamic history is actually a distorted version of the events that happened in Petra. He also says that the Umayyads and Abbasids did this distortion. However, we need to address the black stone issue here, because it has great importance. In Islamic culture, according to narrations, the Hajar al-Aswad was given to Adam and his wife by Gabriel as a guide after they were expelled from paradise and was used in the first Kaaba. After the flood, Prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael found the stone again in the ruins of this ancient structure when rebuilding the destroyed Kaaba, and according to Gabriel's knowledge, they added it to its current corner. And this stone from paradise has always been respected by both Muslims and pagans throughout the ages. This is a very beautiful story, but actually this story does not only belong to the Arabian geography. In our beautiful country, the cradle of civilizations, wherever you reach you will see this goddess figure dating back even earlier than Sumer, and the belief in Cybele will appear before you. Please do not underestimate this belief in the fertility goddess by thinking, oh, it's just one of the idols of the ancient pagans. This belief in the fertility goddess was a symbolism that people valued even in the Paleolithic period, almost 25,000 years ago. And the belief in Cybele is a belief whose traces can be traced back to the 6000 BC, even only in Anatolia. So it was a very, very important belief and symbolism for ancient people. According to what is told, a meteorite fell from the sky thousands of years ago, and the ancient peoples of that time saw this as a sign from the goddess Cybele. Pieces were cut from the black meteorite, and Cybele idols were made and carried around by the followers of the belief in Anatolia, Rome, and Mesopotamia. The name Cybele took the names of goddesses in the belief pantheons of the cultures it visited over thousands of years, and its equivalent in Petra and the Arabian geography is generally Lat. Now you understand better why the pagan Arabs used black stones when worshipping Alat and the other two goddesses. You can also watch my video about the Hajar al-Aswad from years ago on this topic. The link is in the description. According to legends, since one of the original pieces of the meteorite from the skies stayed in Petra for years, Petra became a center of worship for the Qibel cult, and over time, for the Arabs who worshipped Lat, and their Qibla became there. This is where things get intertwined. The concept of Qibla is not actually unique to Islam. It is a concept as old as human rituals. Qibla means direction, turning towards, and turning towards the sacred center during worship has been a recurring motif throughout human history. For this reason, Petra was one of the most important Qiblas for pagan Arabs in its time. But it was not the only Qibla. The Kaaba was not the only Kaaba either. The word Kaaba comes from the root Kab and means something that is cube-shaped. Now let's remember again, the existence of cube-shaped structures greeting people at the entrance of Petra, and they're being generally associated with Lat and Manat. The presence of cube altars in the Baalbek temple, the presence of cube altars in the city of Palmyra, the construction of the Kaaba in the center of Mecca as a large cube, and it's being seen as the home of Lat, Uzza and Manat. You have now completely understood the common motif. Actually, neither the Qibla nor the Kaaba was limited to Petra or Mecca at that time. However, large and popular cities naturally found themselves at the forefront of the historical stage. I don't know about Dan Gibson's claim, but according to my research, after the Roman occupation, the Cybele idol made from the original black meteorite stone in Petra, which the Arabs called Lat, was brought to the other Kaaba in Mecca, which was a safer area, and placed inside. Here we should also not forget that according to this hypothesis, this transfer happened not in the 630s AD, as Dan Gibson said, but more than 500 years earlier. And during the long years that have passed, as the Kaaba was damaged and rebuilt many times, that black stone broke into the small remnants it is today. I would like to add a small note here. Don't think that because the Kaaba is cube-shaped today, it has always been cube-shaped. The Kaaba has been destroyed and rebuilt many times. For this reason, if the narrations are true, it is unknown how Prophet Adam built it. It is unknown how Prophet Abraham built it. We only know its current state, that's all. Thus, thanks to the Cybele idol that came to the Kaaba in Mecca after Petra, Mecca also began to be one of the important qiblas. And you all know the rest. Now what about Dan Gibson's claim that some Umayyad mosques in the early period of Islam faced Petra as their qibla? I think this is also a really interesting claim. If I were to take an objective approach, we are talking about over 1,000 years ago. It is quite normal for there to be angular issues when calculating the qiblas of mosques. Especially as distances increase, small angles can cause large deviations. So my initial approach would be an erroneous design. However, when we are talking about the Umayyads, one has to think twice or thrice. As you know, we are talking about people who were enemies of the Prophet. Frankly, if you say that these people, under the guise of accepting Islam, deliberately made their qiblas towards the Cybele idol in Petra to symbolically perform their old rituals, it would interest me as someone who likes conspiracy theories, and I would not be surprised if the result turned out that way. But as I said, if we are to approach the available data more objectively, the situation does not seem that way to me. Angular deviations caused by careless workmanship and indifference would be a more normal approach in my opinion. In fact, if you have watched Gibson's documentary yourself, you see that after a certain point, the qiblas of the Umayyad mosques in their later period started to deviate significantly. Some qiblas in Andalusia do not even point towards Arabia, let alone towards Mecca. They point directly towards Africa. Dan Gibson's claims personally drew my attention greatly. He also prepared his video well. But it seems he looked at things a bit too one-sidedly and wanted to reach that conclusion. Let alone everything else, we are talking about a massive historical distortion operation. Okay, history is written by the victors. I claim this too. In fact, sometimes we even discuss whether these people intervened in the Quran or distorted the original message during the periods when those manuscripts were destroyed. But the event we are talking about here is based on creating a completely different reality. To say that the entire life of a prophet, everything that happened, actually took place in the revolutionary mega city of Petra, thousands of kilometers away from where it was, is a very, very serious claim. Let's say the Umayyads distorted this. But there are different states around. There are negotiations. There are dozens of tribal groups involved. I think this would definitely have been recorded somehow. Okay, there were events like burning old archives and libraries in Islamic history after the Prophet's death. But changing a historical period spanning years to this extent, even for someone who expects anything from the Umayyads, frankly seemed a bit too forced. But of course, at least this is my opinion. Some of you may agree, some may not. I cannot say anything. I wanted to summarize the available data for you as claims and counterclaims. You can also do your own research. If I were to say my own opinion, I think Dan Gibson focused on Petra and completely relegated Mecca to the background because he addressed the Qibla and Kaaba issue in only one context. However, if we follow the traces of the Cybele culture and research various Qiblas, various black stones, and various Kaaba, i.e. cube-shaped worship area symbolisms, then the situation changes and the concept of pilgrimage centers scattered across the region emerges. As a result, the approach of either the main Qibla and Kaaba was Mecca or Petra, choose one, is refuted. Also, most of his claims are based on hadiths and the somewhat complex narratives of early Islamic historians. Here the issue of time and archives arises. The closest hadith and history books were written an average of 150 years after Prophet Muhammad. This means a very, very significant gap. Therefore, as I always tell you, if we base our research on these sources and put them at the center, much more problematic situations will arise than whether the Kaaba was in Petra or Mecca. For this reason, I prefer not to mention hadiths as much as possible in my videos. Let me not prolong it and finish by saying my final thoughts. I think Mecca was one of the thousands of years old pilgrimage cities that attracted attention seasonally according to the lunar calendar. And since there was no written archive culture in the Arabian geography, or those that existed might have been somehow destroyed as ignorance-era knowledge. For this reason, the city could not come to the forefront of the historical stage, but it was given importance and used by Arab tribes even in the pre-Islamic period. As the city grew over time and became wealthy through religious trade, it began to appear on the historical stage with poems and stories. And during this time, the period of Prophet Muhammad began. Afterwards, with the dominance of Islam in the region, its star shone, and it took its current form. According to me, at least as far as I understand from my research, the story seems to be like this. But I also read the research of Dan Gibson and other historians with curiosity, because they have interesting approaches. And perhaps in the future, if archaeological excavations are expanded in both Petra and Mecca, and new findings are made, you might see even more interesting claims. After all, these are the foggy areas of history. One must be open-minded and curious, but one must not jump to conclusions by watching just one video. This applies to my video, to Dan Gibson, to Ali, to Mehmet, to Aisha. Read the books of all these researchers, watch their videos, and reach a more objective conclusion. The only thing I don't understand in this discussion is this. I see that after this video, there were death threats and verbal attacks against the person, and similar researchers. My friend, why is there a group of people who immediately tend to kill and destroy the other side when it comes to topics related to Islam? Was the Kaaba in Mecca or Petra? If we look at the essence of the matter, what does it matter? It is in Mecca now, and people pray towards it. Why do we attach so much importance to buildings? What is important is the intention. Will the being you believe created the entire universe not accept your prayer because you misaligned your angle while performing it? Or there are those who call the Kaaba the house of Allah. The Kaaba is just a symbolic structure made of stone in the shape of a cube. Here is the inside. Look for yourselves. It has been destroyed, burned, and rebuilt many times, so it is not an untouchable structure. It is just a human creation made to mark the area. So if there is something you should give importance to there, it is the area, not the structure. Why do people kiss and lick its walls? I didn't understand when I went, and I still don't. Yes, the area does put you in a really interesting state of mind. Personally, that was my experience. But when I see such approaches towards the structure itself, it makes me sad. It is unknown how many Kaabas have come and gone throughout history. But if people are looking for the Creator in stone structures instead of in their hearts and consciences, they are no different from the people who chased after that stone thousands of years ago. Of course, worship has symbolic aspects. They exist in all religions. But if communities that turn these symbols into idols and start worshipping them and losing the essence increase, then the situation is bad. That's why, as I've been saying in my videos for years, I think you should leave the symbols and look at the essence. Thank you all for watching the video. Please don't forget to like the videos and share them with your friends for similar content. See you in the next video. Take care.